At 5,300 meters below the surface of the Pacific, where sunlight no longer exists and the pressure crushes anything not made of steel, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet waited in silence for 82 years. Down there, its hull battered by bombs and torpedoes remained upright, its signal bridge still recognizable, as if the ship had refused to completely fall apart. There were no voices, no engines, no alarms. Only the muffled echo of a war that changed the course of the world, and that, nevertheless, left this steel giant vanished without a visible grave, lost in the immensity of the ocean. For decades, its story was told in fragments, combat reports, survivor testimonies, loose pages in military history books. People spoke of the aircraft carrier that launched Doolittle's daring raid over Tokyo, the ship that took part in Midway, the colossus that held out to the limit at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. But they also spoke of its tragic end, of the day when, wrapped in fire, smoke, and twisted steel, it disappeared beneath the waves without anyone knowing exactly where its body had come to rest. Only when its remains were found, so many years later, could the story be told as a whole, from its birth to its last breath, like the life of a being that breathed smoke, gasoline, wind, and steel. The story of the USS Hornet begins long before the bombs, the torpedoes, and the airplanes. It starts in 1940, at the shipyards of Newport News, Virginia, when the United States still watched the war in Europe with a mixture of concern and distance. There, among immense cranes, welding sparks, and the deafening noise of riveting machines, men and women began to shape the hull of a new aircraft carrier. It was not just another ship, it was part of a new generation of naval colossi, destined to turn the airplane into the decisive weapon at sea. While its structure was rising in the shipyards, in other cities across the country, the parts that would complete it were being forged. In Gary and Pittsburgh, steel mills shaped the thick plates that would form its hull and decks. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, expert hands manufactured the fine mechanisms of its guns and steering systems. Every rivet, every plate installed, every cable laid was a bet on the future, a reminder that the country was preparing for a war that many sensed was inevitable. It was not just engineering, it was a race against time. The days followed one another at a frantic pace. Welders, boilermakers, engineers, and supervisors worked exhausting shifts, knowing that every day gained in the shipyard could be a day gained on the battlefield. The Hornet's keel was laid with the solemnity of a ritual. The metal skeleton began to rise, row by row, compartment by compartment. First it was just a framework of beams, then a body with shape, then a closed hull capable of splitting the sea with its bow. On October 20th, 1941, the Hornet was officially commissioned. On her deck, officers wore perfectly pressed uniforms. Crewmen stood in line with straight backs, and flags waved on a day that smelled of fresh paint, sea, and promise. It was the new aircraft carrier of the United States Navy, a key piece on a chessboard that still did not show all its pieces. No one there knew that in less than a year, the country would have suffered Pearl Harbor, and that this very ship would be one of the first to strike back. From the beginning, the Hornet was conceived as a heavy hitter. Her hangars could house dozens of aircraft. Her elevators connected the bowels of the ship with the flight deck in a matter of seconds. Her catapults and arresting wires were designed for the relentless cycle of takeoffs and landings. Her crew would learn to move as a single organism, where each man had a precise function. Machinery, pumps, pipes, fuel tanks, workshops, tiny berths, kitchens, and command posts. A small floating city entirely dedicated to naval air war. 6 months after her commissioning, that colossus would serve as the stage for a feat that would break all the rules of naval warfare. On April 18, 1942, the Hornet sailed the Pacific, not with her usual load of fighters and naval bombers, but with something never seen before: 16 Army B-25 bombers, aircraft designed to operate from land, now perched on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. Their size defied all logic. Their fuselages stretched nose to tail across the deck, leaving barely any room to maneuver. Navy sailors and Army airmen had worked side by side to secure them with cables, chains, and lashings. No one had tried anything like it. Launching medium bombers from an aircraft carrier on the open sea meant playing with physics, aerodynamics, and luck. But the objective justified everything: to strike at the heart of the Japanese Empire, to send a direct message to Tokyo after the trauma of Pearl Harbor. In command of the strike group was James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a legend of aviation even before that morning. He walked the deck personally, inspecting each aircraft, shaking hands, tightening straps, checking that the bombs were properly secured. The wind blew cold. The sky was overcast. The sea moved restlessly beneath the keel. When the time came, the Hornet turned her bow into the wind. Every meter of deck counted. The ship accelerated, cutting through the waves, generating the maximum airflow over the wings of the B-25s. The first bomber, Doolittle's, had in front of it just a few hundred feet to reach takeoff speed. The crew on deck gave precise signals. The engines roared, the deck vibrated, the propellers turned into blurry discs. A gesture, a signal flag, a shout lost in the roar, and the aircraft began its run toward the abyss. For an instant, it seemed too slow. The edge of the deck approached. The sea was there, waiting. Then the wheels stopped touching the wood. The fuselage dropped a few inches into the void, and in a precarious balance the wings generated enough lift. Doolittle rose in front of the bow, lifting off above the waves, disappearing toward the horizon. Behind him, one by one, the other bombers repeated the maneuver. Each takeoff was an act of faith. Each aircraft that managed to rise drew silent applause, gasps, and long-held breaths suddenly released in the chests of the sailors. When the last B-25 disappeared toward Japan, the noise of the engines faded away, replaced by a heavy silence on the Hornet's deck. The men knew they had taken part in something bigger than themselves. They did not know exactly what would happen in Tokyo, nor how those airmen would return. But they understood that they had broken the inertia of defeat. The aircraft carrier was no longer just a set of steel, machines, and weapons. That morning, it had become a symbol, a message in motion for a country that needed hope. A few months later, the Hornet would find herself at the center of another crucial battle: Midway. In June 1942, the entire Pacific became a strategic board where each aircraft carrier was a queen under constant threat. The Hornet sailed accompanied by other colossi, her deck packed with dauntless dive bombers, Devastator torpedo planes, and Wildcat fighters. The pilots knew the coming battle could change the course of the war. The air in the ready rooms was dense, full of nerves and reheated coffee. Maps spread out, coordinates, intelligence reports. Everything pointed to an imminent clash with the Japanese carrier force. Among the units that took off that day was Torpedo Squadron 8, under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Their aircraft, slow and poorly protected, had the most dangerous mission of all: to approach at low altitude the enemy carriers to launch torpedoes. They took off in formation, small dark dots moving over the endless blue. They did not have enough fighters escorting them. They had no margin for error. Still, they pressed on. In mid-flight, Waldron made critical decisions about their course, trying to anticipate the movements of the Japanese fleet. When they finally sighted the enemy carriers, they went in to attack knowing, almost for certain, that many would not return. Japanese fighters descended upon them, and anti-aircraft fire turned the sky into a net of flame and metal. Torpedo 8 continued, one after another, in an act that history would remember as one of the most terrible and heroic sacrifices of the naval air war. Of the 15 planes, none returned to the Hornet. Of 30 men, only one, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating for hours in the sea, a solitary witness to the hell unleashed around him. Waldron's attack did not manage to hit the Japanese carriers. However, their sacrifice disrupted the defenders, drew enemy fighters down to low altitude, and opened a critically valuable corridor for the dive bombers that would arrive later. Midway was decided in a matter of minutes, when the Dauntlesses dropped their bombs on the Japanese carriers, turning deck after deck into uncontrollable infernos. 4 carriers were lost on one side. On the other, the US fleet came away battered, but with its bases intact and the strategic initiative in its hands. For the Hornet, Midway left deep scars. Her squadrons had been hit. Her crew lists now had gaps where names once were. In the berthing compartments, the empty bunks reminded everyone of those who did not come back. In the passageways, men lowered their voices when mentioning certain squadrons. They had won a crucial battle, but the price had been high. The carrier remained operational, but the war allowed no time for mourning. The following months were a test of endurance. In August 1942, the Hornet found herself in the waters around Guadalcanal, a place where jungle, mud, and reefs mixed with the roar of guns and the constant buzz of aircraft. There, for weeks, the carrier operated almost without rest, supporting Marines on land, covering supply convoys, and facing near-daily air attacks. By then, the Hornet had become the last operational U.S. fleet carrier in the South Pacific, a solitary giant forced to bear on her decks a large part of the American naval effort. The strain was brutal. General quarters alarms sounded over and over, at any hour of day or night. Men slept dressed, with life jackets nearby, knowing that at any moment an alarm could throw them from their hammocks to their battle stations. The deck crews patched bomb holes between attacks, replacing plates, welding cracks, repainting charred sections to protect the exposed metal. The gunners of the anti-aircraft batteries developed almost automatic reflexes: acquire, aim, fire, correct, fire again. Gunpowder, smoke, and the persistent smell of fuel mixed with the suffocating humidity of the tropics. Over the Hornet's deck, the sky of Guadalcanal was not a landscape. It was a threat. Every plane appearing on the horizon could be an enemy. Every shadow could be the prelude to a falling bomb. And yet, the routine continued. Takeoffs, landings, refueling, rearming, quick inspections. Pilots climbed into their cockpits, knowing that the runway waiting for them on return, though solid, was not guaranteed. Many would never see it again. Each mission was another spin of a deadly roulette wheel. In that environment, the men learned that survival was not measured only in official victories. It was measured in days gotten through, in attacks repelled, in convoys protected, in comrades still there at the end of the day. The shadow of loss grew longer with each passing week. Familiar names disappeared from the rosters, stories were left unfinished, plans for the future vanished without ever being written down. On October 26, 1942, the Hornet woke to her last day as a fighting ship. It was the day of the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Dawn began with reports of enemy aircraft approaching. First as faint echoes on primitive radar screens, then as dark smudges against the morning light. The tension became almost physical, a weight on the shoulders of every man aboard. Gunners took their positions, sailors secured watertight doors, combat officers crowded around maps and communication equipment. Shortly after 9 in the morning, Japanese aircraft began their attack. From the sky they swooped down, dive bombers and torpedo planes covered by fighters that hurled themselves against the carrier's air defenses. The first hit came around 9:10. A bomb pierced the flight deck, tearing apart internal structures, hurling fragments of steel everywhere and setting off fires immediately. The Hornet shook from keel to mast, as if the ship herself had received a colossal punch. From that moment on, chaos became the rule. Other bombs and torpedoes struck the ship. Internal explosions split compartments, elevators were put out of action, stairways turned into traps of smoke and heat. In the hangar, where aircraft full of fuel and ammunition waited for orders, any spark could become a catastrophe. The air filled with the sharp smell of aviation gasoline, of burning paint, of overheated metal. Damage control teams rushed into smoke-filled passageways, dragging hoses, carrying extinguishers, closing watertight doors, throwing flammable objects overboard. Men soaked in sweat, water, and oil walked among sparks and embers, trying to contain an invisible enemy that moved faster than they did. Fire. In some places, going forward meant crawling through tunnels that no longer had light, guided only by touch and shouted orders in the middle of the roar of bombs and the groan of weakened structures. In the midst of the attack, one of the enemy aircraft, mortally damaged, delivered the most symbolic blow of the day. With its fuselage in flames, it descended out of control and crashed directly into the island superstructure, the brain of the carrier. The impact destroyed antennas, ripped off panels, hurled fragments across the bridge, and started more fires. Communications were gravely affected. Where before there had been precise orders broadcast over loudspeakers, there was now silence, isolated shouts, and the crackling of severed cables. Captain Charles P. Mason, in command of the Hornet, moved through the accessible sections of the deck and passageways as the ship slowly listed. He wore a uniform blackened by smoke, soaked with water, oil, and the effort of hours of combat. His face was covered in soot, but his voice remained firm as he issued orders. He coordinated damage control teams, reassigned personnel, and authorized desperate measures to keep the flames from reaching the magazines. As the day went on, it became clear that the carrier was gravely wounded. Power was lost completely. Without electricity, the pumps to clear the incoming water stopped working. The ventilation systems collapsed, and the lighting failed. The Hornet drifted, without steering, without speed. Her aircraft could no longer operate. Her guns no longer had full capability. As I said, men were now fighting not for victory, but to survive. The ship's list grew more pronounced. The tilt increased. Passageways ceased to be horizontal and turned into ramps. On the lower decks, water rose, cold and relentless. Fires continued to claim space. The enemy kept flying overhead, looking to finish off any ship still afloat. In that desperate scenario, Mason made a decision no captain ever wants to utter: abandon ship. The order passed from voice to voice, from officer to officer, from sailor to sailor. Each man understood immediately what it meant. Many stopped before reaching the evacuation points to take one last look at the place where they had lived, worked, and fought. Some helped wounded comrades reach the boats or the jumping points. Others made sure that everything possible had been done for those who could not move. One by one, the men began to jump into the sea. Below, they found a mixture of water, floating debris, fuel slicks, and small fires on the surface. Nearby destroyers came in as close as they dared, defying the risk of secondary explosions and further attacks. Rescue operations began. They threw nets, boats, life preservers, extended arms, called out names. The water was cold, but adrenaline and fear made that secondary. Mason remained aboard until the end, making sure no one with any chance of evacuation was left behind. Only when he was convinced he had done his duty did he go to the rail, gaze one last time at the tortured silhouette of the Hornet, and let himself fall into the sea. The captain then rejoined his rescued crew aboard the escort ships, while in the distance the carrier continued burning and listing. Despite the devastation, the Hornet did not sink immediately. Wounded, yes, defenseless too, but still afloat. The American forces knew they could not allow the ship, even in that condition, to fall into enemy hands. The decision was brutal, but necessary. She had to be sunk. The destroyers Mustin and Anderson received the order to finish off the giant, that for months had been the home and fortress of so many men. Torpedoes were launched, one after another, following cold, mechanical, almost routine procedures. 9 in all. Some missed, others hit, but without tearing open the hull as expected. The ship's compartmentalized sections, designed precisely to withstand damage and prevent massive flooding, now refused to surrender. The Hornet, even shattered and burning, kept doing what she had been designed to do: stay afloat as long as possible. For hours, the destroyers shelled her hull with gunfire. Nearly 400 rounds rained down on her, piercing plates, tearing away structures, adding devastation to what was already ruined. And still, the carrier kept resisting, as if she had developed a will of her own. Day turned into night, smoke mingled with darkness, and the Hornet remained there, a burning ghost defying her fate. When the American forces finally withdrew, the ship was still afloat, a flaming shell in the vast blackness of the ocean. From the east, in the depth of night, Japanese destroyers arrived. Makigumo and Akigumo approached the dying ship with a clear task: to finish what the battle had begun. Their crews loaded long lance torpedoes, weapons feared for their range and devastating power. After midnight, 4 silvery trails crossed the darkness, heading toward the already exhausted hull of the Hornet. The impacts shook what remained of her structure. The explosions opened final wounds in her flank. The carrier, which had withstood bombs, torpedoes, fires, scuttling attempts, and the abandonment of her own men, finally began to yield. Her bow lifted slightly, her stern sank, and slowly, like a huge city tilting toward the abyss, the Hornet disappeared beneath the surface. Inside, 21 aircraft remained trapped in the hangar. Silent engines, bombs that would never explode, abandoned tools, sealed doors, empty rooms. As the water claimed each compartment, the flag still flew somewhere on her superstructure, until the last possible instant. When she finally vanished beneath the waves, she did so in the silence the sea always imposes on its victims. For decades, the only things that remained on the surface of history were fragmented memories, combat reports, figures. 140 men lost in the Battle of Santa Cruz, 1 fewer carrier on the roster, rumors about her approximate position. Families had no grave where they could take flowers, only symbolic headstones, plaques on monuments, names engraved in marble far from where their bodies truly rested. The Pacific kept the Hornet and refused to give her up. It was not until January 2019 that this silence began to break. The research vessel Petrel, equipped with modern technology, dedicated itself to scanning the depths near the Solomon Islands. Guided by battle maps, approximate coordinates, and a blend of science, patience, and respect, the researchers deployed remotely operated vehicles toward the ocean floor. As they descended, the light faded, and absolute darkness covered everything. Only the ROV's spotlights pierced the blackness. At 7,500 feet deep, a familiar outline appeared on the screens. At first, it was vague lines, then a recognizable silhouette. A massive hull, resting on the bottom, listing, but still upright. As the cameras drew closer, details emerged. The shape of the bridge, the characteristic island structure, the collapsed sections of the flight deck, the remains of the elevators. There was no doubt. The USS Hornet had been found. In the Petrel's control room, voices fell quiet. Some of those present discreetly wiped away tears. Before them was not just a relic. It was a tomb, a silent testimony to a distant battle and to the men who did not return. The hull bore the scars of that October 26, 1942. Bent sections, visible impact points, burnt areas frozen in time. Nothing moved around it except specks of sediment drifting like dust in a closed room. News of the discovery spread quickly. For historians, it was the definitive confirmation of many details that until then they had known only from writings and accounts. For families, it was the closing of a circle that had remained open for more than 3 generations. The exact place where the Hornet rested was now known, although it would remain inaccessible to direct visits. The sea would continue to be her guardian, but it could no longer completely hide her. Although books had been written, documentaries filmed, and lectures given about the carrier's history, the discovery of her remains added a new layer of reality. To physically see the signal bridge, the corroded gun mounts, the sunken flight deck, the marks of the explosions, made everything described take on a different weight. The sacrifices were no longer just words on paper. They had shape, volume, texture, even in ruins. Some details of her final minutes remain uncertain. Combat records, Survivors' memories and official documents do not always agree on times, sequences, and perceptions. Parts of the after-action reports remain classified or incomplete. The sea, despite modern technology, still keeps some secrets to itself. But the essentials are clear. The Hornet fought as long as she could, survived longer than expected, refused to sink quickly, and was ultimately sent to the bottom by enemy torpedoes after her own ships had tried to finish her off. Today, the story of the USS Hornet is told not only in museums and books, but also with images of her own skeleton on the seafloor. It is the story of an aircraft carrier built in haste, but with precision, that took part in one of the most audacious air raids of the war, that saw its squadrons sacrifice themselves at Midway, that held the line at Guadalcanal, and that withstood devastating blows before disappearing beneath the waves. Her legacy lives on in every account of those days, in every name engraved on memorials, in every family that can finally picture exactly where their dead rest. The Hornet, even from the darkness thousands of meters beneath the Pacific, continues to speak to the world about courage, endurance, and the staggering price of war. Her hull, upright and silent, is a reminder that even colossi can fall. But their stories, once rescued from oblivion, remain forever on the waves of memory. The discovery of the Hornet on the floor of the Pacific did not just solve a geographic unknown. It opened an emotional and symbolic door that had been closed for more than 80 years. From that moment on, every image captured by the Petrel's cameras became a kind of window into the past. The shots showing the bow partially buried in sediment, the sections of the flight deck bent like paper, the remains of structures that once held antennas, masts, and cables revealed a ship trapped in the instant after her agony. Experts devoted long hours to observing every corner of those videos. They paused the footage, zoomed in on details, compared them with period photographs, construction blueprints, and veterans' accounts. Every match reinforced a powerful idea. The Hornet was not only identifiable, she was frozen in a posture that seemed almost defiant. She had not collapsed onto her side, nor lay scattered in pieces across the bottom. She remained upright, though listing, preserving her aircraft carrier silhouette, as if even in death she refused to abandon her dignity. Naval engineers focused their attention on the damage patterns. Where a bomb had pierced the deck, the metal showed twisted edges that spoke of extreme heat and instantaneous pressure. In other areas, shell impacts had left circular marks, depressions in the plating, that were essentially scars from that final bombardment. By mentally reconstructing the sequence of blows, they could almost hear again the explosions, the groan of steel giving way, the shouts, the alarms. For historians, the discovery was a physical confirmation of what they had spent years piecing together from scattered documents. Destroyers' logs, battle reports, memoirs of officers who had served in the fleet, interviews with pilots who had taken off from her deck. All those fragments now found their material counterpart. The sunken ship became the centerpiece of a narrative puzzle that, at last, could be assembled with greater precision. Relatives of the fallen, many of them elderly by then, recounted stories they had heard in hushed tones when they were children. Some remembered how their parents, brothers, or uncles avoided speaking about the Hornet, not because they had forgotten her, but because it hurt too much. Others had grown up with black and white photos of young men in immaculate uniforms, without knowing exactly where their lives had ended. The announcement that the ship had been located at a specific point in the ocean gave them something they had never had: a real reference, a place, though unreachable, they could imagine when they closed their eyes. In ceremonies on solid ground, flags were raised at half-mast. At some events, images of the sunken hull were projected on giant screens. The audience silently watched as the ROV's lights illuminated a rusted anti-aircraft gun, a section of the deck's edge, fragments of railings that still seemed to hold the shape of a bulwark, where men had once looked out at the horizon. They were not spectacular shots in cinematic terms, but their symbolic force was enormous. There it was, in its current form, the ship they had heard about so many times. In schools and naval academies, instructors began using the Hornet's story as a teaching example. They did not speak only of tactics, maneuvers, and command decisions. They also analyzed the human dimension of serving aboard an aircraft carrier in World War II. They explained how daily life on such a ship was a constant balance between routine and danger. Aboard the Hornet, as on other carriers, days could pass in repetitive tasks, cleaning decks, checking equipment, preparing ammunition, maintaining engines, and, in a matter of minutes, turn into a storm of frantic activity when an attack was ordered or an air threat appeared. Pilots who had operated from her deck described the feeling of walking toward their planes with the wind whipping against their jackets, the smell of fuel saturating everything, the gestures of mechanics checking the same critical points again and again. The carrier was a universe of hand signals, lights, sirens, and routines, where dozens of people had to coordinate in precise choreography so that a single aircraft could take off without incident. Now, seeing the twisted flight deck on the seafloor, those testimonies took on another dimension. The planks that once vibrated under the wheels of the planes were now an unmoving field covered in marine silt. The Hornet's story also highlighted the evolution of naval air combat. Before the war, many sailors still saw the battleship as the centerpiece of maritime power. However, as the war progressed, it became clear that the aircraft carrier was the true axis of power projection. The Hornet was the product of that transition, a machine conceived to put an airstrike force into the sky rather than to fire huge guns from her deck. That transformation was dramatically evident in the Doolittle raid. Launching long-range bombers from her deck was a challenge that broke paradigms, but it was also a preview of the audacity that would characterize later naval air operations. The spirit of "the impossible is necessary" permeated the way the carrier was used throughout her few but intense months of service. Every mission seemed to stretch the limits of what was considered feasible. Midway, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz. Each of those campaigns left a mark on the Hornet and her crew. The men who served aboard went, in less than a year, from feeling they were on a powerful brand new machine to experiencing the sight of that same ship devastated by enemy fire. For many of them, the memory of those days would be a burden for the rest of their lives. A lesser-told part of that story has to do with the silence that followed. Survivors returned to other ships, to bases, to hospitals, and later, after the war, to civilian life. They went back to cities where the name Hornet might appear in the newspapers, but where daily life did not revolve around that loss. Some chose not to speak about what they had seen: the chaos of combat, the bodies, the feeling of abandoning the ship to which they had devoted so much effort. Others, over time, began to share stories at veterans' reunions or with their families, trying to put into words something that would never fully fit into sentences. The discovery of the wreck allowed many of those testimonies to be reinterpreted. A former gunner, already very old when he heard of the find, explained that for years, every time he heard the echo of thunder, he remembered the roar of bombs striking the deck. He said that seeing the ship, even on a screen, finally allowed him to feel that the chapter had a physical closure. It was not that the pain disappeared, but now he could picture the Hornet in a specific place, at rest, far from fire and smoke. One aspect that impressed the researchers was the way the seafloor had embraced the carrier. In some areas, the hull was partially covered by sediments that looked like a thin blanket, laid down patiently over decades. In others, the structure was exposed, showing clean cuts where explosions had opened paths. Marine life had colonized certain surfaces, turning parts of the hull into shelter for fish, invertebrates, and deep corals. The ship, designed for war, had unintentionally become a small ecosystem in the depths. This led to debates about the relationship between war wrecks and the environment. Some scientists pointed out that many wrecks, including carriers like the Hornet, ultimately play an ecological role by providing solid structures in areas where the bottom is otherwise uniformly muddy. Those hulls give rise to biodiversity in places that would otherwise be less varied. The paradox is evident: tools of destruction that, with time, become supports for new life. At the same time, respect for the human remains inside the ship meant that any idea of invasive exploration was ruled out. The consensus was clear: the Hornet should not be disturbed. No piece should be recovered unless strictly necessary for specific technical reasons. The idea of removing objects as souvenirs was completely out of the question. The ship was not a potential museum, but an inviolable grave. On a symbolic level, the Hornet began to represent more than just a detailed chapter of World War II. She became a reminder of the stories the sea keeps in silence. For every ship located, there are many others still lost. For every family that gains an answer, there are others that continue wondering what exactly happened to their loved ones. The carrier's discovery was, in that sense, a light in the middle of an ocean of unknowns. It also helped underline the continuity between past and present. The technology that made it possible to find her, high-resolution sonar, remotely operated vehicles, precise navigation systems, is the product of decades of advances that, in part, rest on innovations developed during the very war in which the Hornet fought. In a way, the technological evolution that the conflict accelerated would many years later become the tool that allowed her to be seen again. On the surface, the memory of the Hornet is also linked to another ship that inherited her name, USS Hornet, CV-12, an Essex-class carrier that later entered service and today, converted into a museum ship, receives visitors at quiet piers, far from the noise of guns. Although it is a different vessel, the stories of the two are intertwined. Many visitors arrive at the museum knowing there was an earlier Hornet that sank in 1942. There, information panels, photographs and scale models tell the life of CV-8, the first to bear that name during the war. The image of the carrier lost in the Pacific, and the museum ship visitable in times of peace function as a narrative bridge. One shows sacrifice and cost, the other, remembrance and education. Together, they draw a line from the days when sailors ran across smoke-filled decks to the present, where children walk those same structures, listening to guides and veterans, touching railings that might look very much like those present in 1942. In the talks given at the museum, the story of the Doolittle Raid, the Battle of Midway, and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands is told again and again, but each time with new nuances. The discovery of the wreck has allowed the inclusion of details that were once only conjecture. Now it is known with greater certainty how the ship was left after the attack, how she settled on the bottom, how the structure endured over the decades. Those elements make the narrative more concrete, more tangible, even for those without a family connection to the men who served there. The Hornet has also become a recurring reference when discussing the ethics of remembrance in peacetime. How do you properly honor a ship that served in a devastating war? How do you speak of bravery without glorifying destruction? How do you teach the importance of her history without losing sight of the suffering it implies? The answer is usually found in a balance of respect, detail, and honesty. It is not about presenting the ship as an untouchable myth, nor reducing her to a series of technical data. It is about remembering her for what she was, a tool of war crewed by human beings with fears, hopes, and lives that unfolded among orders, cramped bunks, and skies full of planes. Researchers who studied the Hornet's wreck emphasize something that is not immediately visible in the footage: the feeling of being in front of a sealed capsule from 1942. Every shut hatch, every flooded room, every passageway blocked by debris speaks of a moment frozen in time. Nothing that happened after that day ever entered there. World news, the following decades, technological changes, new generations, all of that stayed outside. Inside the sunken hull, history stopped at the precise moment the sea finished covering it. When imagining daily life aboard during her months of service, it is inevitable to think of the mixture of youth and inexperience shared by many of her crewmen. Some had not even turned 20. Many came from small towns, distant farms, cities where the ocean was just an abstract idea. In a matter of months, they learned to live in an environment where danger was constant, and discipline was the only way to maintain sanity and effectiveness. The relationship between the men and the ship was, in its own way, intimate. Each man knew the characteristic sounds of his section, the hum of certain machines, the rhythmic thump of pumps, the peculiar whistle of a pipe. They knew when a noise was normal and when it meant something was wrong. That familiarity with their surroundings turned the Hornet into something more than metal. She was an uncomfortable but familiar home, an armed refuge that had taken them to places they never would have imagined, from the cold of Midway to the burning skies of Guadalcanal. The fact that today, that same ship lies in silence, intact in essence though deformed by violence and time, evokes a deep sense of respect. The story can no longer be changed. The bombs have already fallen. The torpedoes have already hit. The ship has already sunk. The only thing left to do is look, understand, and remember. The work of the researchers in documenting the wreck and ensuring its protection is not only scientific, it is almost a way of guarding memory. The Hornet, lost for 82 years, now forms part of a more clearly defined narrative. Her contribution to the war, her role in key operations, her endurance on her last day of combat, and the way she was finally located make up a narrative arc that stretches from the shipyards of Newport News to the depths of the Pacific. Each stage carries its own weight, but together they tell a single story, that of an aircraft carrier that embodied the effort, audacity, and sacrifice of an entire generation. In the end, what remains is not only the image of the enormous hull resting on the seafloor, nor merely the technical details of her construction or destruction. What survives is the awareness that behind every corroded plate, every rivet, every gap where once there was a plane or a gun, there were hands at work, glances exchanged, voices shouting instructions, brief laughter in spare moments, silences shared beneath a sky full of threats. The Hornet now speaks from two worlds, from the past that saw her sail and fight, and from the present that contemplates her in silence through cameras that travel along her sleeping skeleton. Between those 2 points, a single line joins the men who built her, crewed her, lost her, and found her. That line is memory, and as long as her story continues to be told, the aircraft carrier will continue to float in some way upon the waters of human consciousness. As news of the Hornet's discovery spread, reflections began to emerge that went beyond simple historical interest. A profound debate arose about the nature of warships as physical objects, as symbols, and as sea graves. More and more people, from historians to civilians, with no apparent connection to the armed forces, were asking themselves the same question. What does it really mean for a lost ship to reappear after so many years? For many, the Hornet represented an emotionally difficult paradox. On the one hand, she was a combat vessel, designed to launch lethal attacks and defend herself with violence. On the other, she was a home, a space where hundreds of men lived, worked, dreamed, of returning, and in many cases faced their final moments. That duality became more palpable when people saw the images of the sunken hull. It was not just an abandoned military object. It was a silent witness to interrupted lives. Underwater heritage experts compared the discovery to other significant finds, such as that of USS Indianapolis or the battleship Yamato. But they emphasized something unique about the Hornet. Despite being the target of one of the fiercest attacks against a US carrier in World War II, her structure, though deformed, still retained her essence. The command island was still standing, the characteristic angles of the hull were recognizable, and the overall layout of her decks was still evident. It was as if the ship had preserved a certain posture in death, a kind of final gesture before disappearing beneath the waves. As the Petrel's footage traveled along every part of the ship, tiny details gained meaning. There, in a corner covered with sediment, what seemed to be a twisted handrail could be seen. Farther on, a section of deck, deformed by heat, displayed shadows and folds that reproduced, frozen, the chaos of the fire that spread that October 26, 1942. Even part of the structure that had once supported antennas was still standing, though without cables or gear. The skeleton remained, a broken geometry that had withstood the sea's extreme pressure for 8 decades. Seeing those images, many people reflected on the architecture of carriers of that era. Ships of the Yorktown class, to which the Hornet belonged, were designed with a mixture of speed, ingenuity, and necessity. They did not have the massive armor of battleships, but they did have a configuration designed to maximize the operational efficiency of their aircraft. Their strength lay in their ability to launch planes and quickly recover, refuel, rearm, and send them back into the air. They were mobile platforms, not floating fortresses, and that made them vulnerable to direct hits like those that destroyed the Hornet at Santa Cruz. However, seeing her structure still firm on the sea floor was evidence of remarkable engineering. The ship had not broken in two like so many others sunk in combat. Nor had she disintegrated over time. Even the damaged sections could be visually reconstructed. For those who study material resistance, this was a testament to the work of the thousands of people who had built her under intense pressure at the Newport News shipyards. The discovery also gave rise to discussions about historical memory and the relationship between generations. Many families whose grandparents or great-grandparents had served in the Navy discovered details they had never known. Some found in the Hornet a belated point of connection with family stories that had seemed incomplete. Others realized that elements they had always thought exaggerated, stories about the Doolittle raid, about Midway or Santa Cruz, had actually been reflections of a chapter of enormous relevance in the war. Even people with no direct ties to veterans felt moved upon seeing the sunken hull. Something in those images evoked both technological greatness and human fragility. To see the Hornet's remains in that condition, resting in absolute silence, stirred a mixture of sadness, respect, and awe. It was easy to imagine the shouts drowned out by the noise of explosions, the desperate orders over the radio, the frantic race to extinguish fires, the leap into the sea in a pure act of survival. And now, all of that had been reduced to eternal silence. There were also those who saw in the discovery an opportunity to talk about the emotional cost borne by survivors. Those sailors who made it back alive carried for decades the memory of abandoning the ship. Many described how, for years, they could not forget the smell of burning fuel mixed with salt water. Others spoke of the helplessness they felt watching the Hornet withstand torpedo after torpedo without sinking, as if the ship herself refused to die. For some veterans, seeing images of the hull finally resting in a definitive place was a kind of belated relief. Among the documents that came to light after the discovery, one in particular resonated with historians. A record from a sailor who had survived Santa Cruz. In a letter written in 1943, he mentioned that what hurt him most was not abandoning the ship, but not knowing where she had gone down. "I can't picture it," he wrote, "and maybe that's why it keeps showing up in my dreams." Now, more than 70 years later, the exact location had finally been identified. It was not just a point on a map, it was an emotional answer the ocean had held back for far too many decades. The Hornet also inspired more technical studies on the effect of extreme pressure on metal structures. Engineers noted that some sections seemed compressed in a way very different from what would have occurred at a shallower depth. The pressure at more than 5 kilometers beneath the sea is enough to deform even the strongest structures. And yet much of the hull had endured. Analyses showed that although battered, the ship still retained coherent proportions. Compared with other carriers sunk in shallower waters, the Hornet offered a unique case for studying how certain materials age in extreme conditions. The wreck's unexpected ecological role also attracted attention. Marine biologists observed that the ship had become a point of life within a deep environment that is often uniform and desolate. Small organisms had attached themselves to the hull, forming layers that sheltered invertebrates, deep-sea fish, and bioluminescent microorganisms. The rusting steel had turned into an ecosystem. Some scientists noted that this phenomenon, war wrecks generating life, is one of the strangest contrasts in the deep ocean. Where so many people died, small forms of life now flourish, adapted to absolute cold and eternal darkness. The Hornet's discovery also raised questions about the long-term conservation of war remains. Researchers and governments debated whether some kind of legal protection should be placed over the wreck site. Although it lies in deep waters, beyond the reach of casual explorers, there is concern about future technologies that could allow easier access. Most agreed that the Hornet should be considered a war grave and a historically protected site. No expedition should alter her surroundings or remove objects without strictly scientific justification. In the cultural realm, the Hornet began appearing in books, documentaries, and exhibitions that capitalized on the power of the recovered images. Painters and digital artists recreated scenes of the ship in her original form, inspired by period photographs and by the wreck's current silhouette. The combination of past and present reinforced a persistent message. History does not disappear. It only waits to be rediscovered. Many young people, upon seeing the original documentary of the discovery, were struck by the clarity with which modern technology could reveal details in the ocean's darkness. For those who had grown up consuming video games, movies, and realistic simulations, seeing the Hornet's real hull, imperfect, corroded, twisted, created a shock when compared with their idealized representations. It was a reminder that war is not a spectacle, but something profoundly human, marked by mistakes, improvisations, sacrifices, and tragedies. In today's Navy, the name Hornet still evokes respect. Although other ships have borne that name since, CV-8 has become a special symbol. Her history is taught as an example of courage, operational capability, determination under pressure, and loyalty among comrades. In speeches at official ceremonies, her role at Midway, her part in the Doolittle raid, and her endurance at Santa Cruz are all mentioned. But now, thanks to the 2019 discovery, her resting place can also be acknowledged, a detail that had been missing from commemorations for many years. In naval culture, it is sometimes said that ships have souls, a metaphor meant to describe the emotional bond that forms between crew and vessel. Even without believing that literally, many veterans and modern sailors recognize that there are ships whose memory seems more alive than that of others. The Hornet is one of them. Her story feels complete. Origin, mission, achievements, tragedy, disappearance, and rediscovery. Each stage carries weight, coherence, and emotion. Throughout all these analyses, details, and reflections, one thing remains constant: the sense that, although she now rests far from any shore, the Hornet is still an active part of collective memory.